Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere the sun simply doesn't bother to show up. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months at a stretch. Tonight's story isn't about darkness as a metaphor. It's about darkness as a literal, permanent, inconvenient fact of daily life for the small groups of researchers who choose, every year, to live through it anyway. Before we get comfortable, if this is your kind of quiet, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find something here worth returning to. A heartfelt thank you, as always, to everyone leaving topic suggestions in the comments. I read every one, and tonight's journey exists because enough of you asked what it's actually like to sleep through a winter that never lets the sun in. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what the darkness outside your own window looks like right now. It's always something, hearing from all corners of the world at once. If you'd rather listen than watch, the channel is on Spotify now too. Link waiting for you in the description. And if you'd like a little more of this after tonight, membership is open on the channel for extended ad-free listening whenever sleep won't come easily. Now, dim your lights. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background and settle in, because you're about to spend a season somewhere the sky simply goes dark and stays that way. Have you ever wondered what it actually does to a person, week after week, to wake up and step outside into the same black sky they left behind 12 hours earlier? Whether the body eventually stops expecting morning at all, or whether some quiet, stubborn part of it keeps waiting anyway. Whether sleep comes easier in that kind of dark or harder. Whether a person could build an entire private, artificial day out of nothing but lamps and habit and sheer will, and have it actually work. You're about to find out, because tonight, you are one of the researchers. You are standing at a frosted window somewhere north of the Arctic Circle, and it is, as far as your body can tell, the middle of the afternoon. The clock on the wall agrees. The sky outside does not. It has been the same shade of deep, star-heavy blue-black for weeks now, and it will stay that way for weeks more. This is polar night. The long stretch of the year when the sun drops below the horizon and simply declines to come back up. And you live inside it now, in a research station built to keep a small crew of scientists warm, sane, and functioning through months when the world outside offers no daylight at all. You came here for the science. Nobody warned you quite how strange the sleeping would become. The station hums quietly around you, heating systems working steadily against a cold that would kill you within minutes if you stepped outside unprepared. Somewhere down the corridor, a colleague is finishing a shift, another is waking for one, and the artificial rhythm of the place carries on exactly as it's designed to, indifferent to the fact that outside every window, the sky offers no clue at all about what hour it might be. You've been here long enough now that the strangeness has mostly worn into routine. Mostly. There are still moments, standing at this window in your regulation afternoon, staring at what looks for all the world like midnight, when something old and animal in you quietly insists that this cannot be right, that no one should be awake and working under a sky like this, that bodies are meant to sleep when it's dark and wake when it's light. And this whole operation is, on some deep unspoken level, cheating. And in a way, it is. That's rather the whole point of tonight's story. Let's start with the shape of the thing you're actually living inside. Polar night isn't a single uniform darkness dropped over the whole Arctic like a blanket. It arrives differently depending on where exactly you are standing on the globe. And the station you're picturing tonight sits far enough north that the sun doesn't merely dip low for a few weeks. It disappears below the horizon entirely and stays there for an extended stretch. sometimes lasting well over 2 months in the highest latitude stations. A little shorter the further south you go toward the edge of the Arctic Circle itself. In some places, the darkness is genuinely near total, a black sky broken only by stars, moonlight when the moon cooperates, and if you're fortunate, the aurora painting slow green light across the sky. In other places, closer to that circle's edge, there's a strange in-between phenomenon locals and researchers alike call civil twilight. A few hours each day when the sun stays hidden below the horizon, but its light still bends up faintly through the atmosphere, giving the sky a soft blue-gray glow for an hour or two before fading back to black. It isn't day. It certainly isn't night in any ordinary sense either. It's something the body doesn't quite know what to do with, a smear of not quite light that shows up right when your internal clock would very much like a clear answer and gets, instead, a shrug. You've learned, these past weeks, to stop expecting the sky to tell you anything useful. That's the first adjustment every researcher here makes, usually within the first 10 days, and it's a bigger one than it sounds. Your entire life up to this point ran on a signal you never had to think about. Sunlight rising and falling, telling your body without a single conscious decision on your part when to feel alert and when to feel sleepy. That signal is gone now. Not dimmed, not softened. Gone. And your body, it turns out, does not take that gracefully. Somewhere in your skull, sitting quietly behind your eyes, is a cluster of cells scientists call the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and its entire job, its only job really, is to track light and use it to set the timing of nearly everything your body does without your permission: hormone release, core temperature, alertness, the whole quiet machinery of a day. It receives its information through your eyes, specifically through light-sensitive cells that aren't even used for seeing images, cells whose sole purpose is registering brightness and reporting it upstream. For your entire life before this posting, that system worked exactly as intended, because it always had a sunrise and a sunset to work with. Now, it has neither. And what a body does when its primary timekeeping signal simply vanishes is not, contrary to what you might hope, gracefully idle in place waiting for further instructions. It starts drifting. Left with no external anchor, a human internal clock left running on its own actually settles into a rhythm slightly longer than 24 hours, and without daylight to correct it back into place each morning the way it normally would, that drift compounds day after day, a little later and a little later again, until a person's private sense of morning has quietly wandered clean around the clock. This is, incidentally, one of the great open secrets of polar research life, one none of the recruitment materials mention with quite the same enthusiasm as the science itself. Left entirely to their own devices, without any structure imposed on them, researchers wintering through polar night have been known to slide into sleep schedules that bear almost no resemblance to a conventional day at all, going to bed an hour or two later each cycle until eventually they're waking for what their bodies insist is morning at an hour that any outside clock would call the dead of night. It's not laziness. It's not indiscipline. It's simply what an unanchored circadian system does when the only cue it's ever known to rely on stops showing up. Understanding this, really understanding it, is the whole reason a station like the one you're standing in now runs on such a strict, almost stubborn schedule. Because someone, somewhere, quite a while ago, learned this lesson the hard way, watched a crew's sleep schedules scatter in a dozen different directions over the course of a winter, and decided that structure wasn't optional. It was survival. Which brings you back to this window, to this particular ordinary Tuesday afternoon that looks, for all the world, like the deepest part of the night. You know it's afternoon, not because anything outside tells you so, but because the station's rhythm tells you so. Because breakfast happened at a fixed hour this morning under bright artificial light designed to mimic something like a sunrise. Because your shift schedule says so. Because the small, deliberate architecture of manufactured time that the whole crew agreed to live inside of says so loudly and repeatedly, specifically so that none of you have to trust your own drifting internal sense of things. You'll learn, over the coming months, to trust the clock on the wall, over the sky, outside the window every single time. Because the sky, out here, has stopped being a reliable narrator. For now, though, there's work to finish before your sleep period, and the window can wait. You turn from it, back toward the warm, lit corridor of the station, and somewhere behind you, through the double-paned glass, the dark presses in against the building the way it will for the rest of the season. Patient, total, not going anywhere. Let's talk properly now about what polar night actually is, because the version most people carry around in their heads, the sun vanishes, and it's simply dark for months, undersells just how strange and specific the astronomy of the thing really is. Polar night happens because of the tilt of the Earth's axis, the same tilt responsible for seasons everywhere else on the planet, just taken to its logical extreme at high latitude. As the Earth swings through its yearly orbit, the poles lean either toward or away from the sun, and at latitudes far enough north or south, that lean becomes severe enough that for part of the year the sun never climbs above the horizon at all, no matter what hour the clock claims it is. The precise length of that darkness depends entirely on exactly how far north you are. Cross the Arctic Circle itself, and you get at least one 24-hour period each winter where the sun doesn't rise, a bare minimum most people picture when they imagine polar night. Push further north, toward the latitudes where many research stations actually sit, and that single dark day stretches into weeks, and at the more extreme research outposts nearer the pole itself, into 2 full months or longer, an unbroken stretch of night that outlasts most people's patience for almost anything. And within that stretch, the darkness itself isn't uniform either, which surprises almost everyone who arrives, expecting flat, featureless black for the entire duration. At the deepest part of the season, in the weeks closest to the winter solstice, you get what's properly called astronomical polar night, when the sun sits so far below the horizon that its light contributes nothing at all, not even the faintest indirect glow, and the sky stays genuinely, thoroughly dark around the clock, broken only by stars, moonlight, and if conditions cooperate, aurora. But at the edges of the season, as the sun's position creeps back toward the horizon, you move through stages. Nautical twilight, then civil twilight, each one bringing a little more indirect light bending up through the atmosphere for a few hours each day, until eventually, weeks later, the sun's disk actually breaks the horizon again for the first time, and the whole crew, without fail, finds some excuse to be outside for it. You haven't reached that part yet. Right now you're deep in the astronomical stretch, the true middle of it, where day and night have stopped being useful words at all, and the only real distinction left is which hours the station has designated for sleeping, and which it hasn't. It's a strange kind of freedom in its way once you stop fighting it. The sky has nothing left to offer you by way of instruction, so the only clock left that matters is the one the crew builds together, deliberately, out of habit and light and shared agreement, which is precisely where tonight's story is headed next, into the quiet architecture of how a research station manufactures its own mornings entirely from scratch when the real one has stopped showing up. But that's for the chapter ahead. For now, you have a shift to finish, and the dark outside the window is going to keep right on waiting, exactly as patient as it's been for weeks. Exactly as patient as it'll be for weeks still to come. Let's talk about what your body has been doing to you these past few weeks, because it's worth naming honestly rather than glossing over the way the recruitment brochures tend to. The official term researchers and sleep scientists use for what happens to circadian rhythm during an extended stretch without light cues is desynchronization, a clinical word for a distinctly unclinical, deeply personal experience. The quiet unraveling of your body's confidence about what time it is. You've felt it in smaller ways almost every day since the true darkness set in. A heaviness in the early afternoon that has nothing to do with how much you slept the night before. A stretch, late in what the clock insists is evening, where you feel unexpectedly, almost aggressively alert, wide awake at an hour your body used to consider firmly, boringly asleep. Nights where sleep comes in fragments instead of one solid block, where you wake at what feels like an arbitrary hour, fully rested and fully confused, only to check the clock and discover you've slept perhaps 4 hours, not 8. This isn't insomnia in the ordinary sense, and it isn't restlessness either, not exactly. It's your suprachiasmatic nucleus, that small, stubborn cluster of cells behind your eyes, doing the one thing it was never designed to do gracefully. Operate with no external light signal to anchor it. Left to run on its own internal rhythm. Unassisted, it doesn't hold steady. It drifts, and the drift isn't the same for every person, which is its own strange complication of station life. 2 colleagues living in the exact same building, eating the exact same meals at the exact same scheduled hours, can nonetheless find their private, felt sense of daytime and nighttime slowly diverging from each other over the course of weeks, one drifting a little later, one holding steadier, until without the discipline of a shared schedule imposed from outside, the whole crew's sleep patterns would eventually scatter across the clock like a badly shuffled deck. Researchers describe this in a dozen different ways once you ask them directly. Some describe a feeling uncomfortably close to permanent jet lag without ever having boarded a plane. Some describe dreams growing unusually vivid or unusually frequent during these weeks, a phenomenon sleep researchers link to the disruption of normal sleep stage timing, as REM sleep, ordinarily anchored to particular hours of a normal night, shifts and stretches along with everything else. Some describe, more simply, a persistent low fog, a sense of being slightly out of step with their own body that never quite resolves into anything dramatic enough to call illness, but never quite lifts either, for as long as the true darkness lasts. The hormone most directly responsible for a great deal of this is melatonin, the chemical your brain releases each evening as light fades, the one substance most responsible for the physical sensation of sleepiness settling in. Under a normal sky, melatonin release follows sunset with remarkable, almost mechanical reliability, rising as daylight fades, falling again as it returns. Take away the sunset entirely, and melatonin release doesn't stop, but it stops being anchored to anything meaningful. It can begin creeping earlier or later depending on artificial light exposure, on individual variation, on nothing at all that makes intuitive sense from the inside. You've felt this yourself some evenings, a wave of sleepiness arriving at what the clock insists is mid-afternoon, powerful enough to fight and usually winning in some small way, a 5-minute doze at a desk you didn't intend to take. This is, incidentally, precisely why the station doesn't leave any of this to chance or to individual willpower, and precisely why the schedule you live inside feels, at times, almost aggressively rigid. Meals at fixed hours, bright light exposure at fixed hours, sleep periods that the whole crew observes together regardless of how any individual happens to feel on a given afternoon. It can feel in your more tired moments faintly absurd. An entire crew of trained scientists organizing their lives around a schedule as strict as a boarding school's, purely because the sky has stopped being trustworthy. But you've come to understand, these past weeks, that the rigidity isn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It's the only substitute available for the signal that's missing. Somebody, or something, has to tell the body what time it is when the sun refuses to. Out here, that job falls to the clock on the wall, the light fixtures in the ceiling, and the collective, deliberate discipline of everyone in the building agreeing, together, to pretend there's a sunrise happening on schedule every single morning, whether the sky agrees or not. Which is exactly where tonight's story turns next, into the quiet machinery the station uses to build that pretend sunrise, and how convincingly, or unconvincingly, a room full of carefully positioned lamps can actually stand in for a star 93 million miles away. Morning, here, is not something that happens to you. It's something the station does to you, deliberately, on purpose, at a fixed hour, using nothing but electricity and careful design, because nature has entirely stopped participating in the process. You've come to recognize the particular quality of light that floods the station's common areas at what the schedule designates as 6 in the morning, a soft, gradually intensifying glow that builds over several minutes rather than snapping on all at once, engineered specifically to mimic the slow climb of a real sunrise as closely as a fixture bolted to a ceiling reasonably can. This is bright light therapy, and it isn't a small detail of station life. It's arguably the single most important piece of infrastructure keeping the crew's collective sanity intact through the darkest stretch of the season. The lamps themselves are specialized, built to output a level of brightness many, many times stronger than an ordinary household bulb, calibrated specifically to hit the light-sensitive cells behind your eyes, hard enough to convince your suprachiasmatic nucleus that morning has genuinely arrived. That daylight, real daylight, is here, and it's time to be alert. You sit in front of one most mornings for a set stretch of time, coffee in hand, in what amounts to a small, quiet ritual the whole crew observes together, less a treatment and more a shared habit, everyone gathered in the same brightly lit room at the same fixed hour, manufacturing consensus about what time of day it is. It looks, from the outside, faintly ridiculous. A dozen adults sitting in folding chairs facing rows of lamps like sunbathers at a very cold, very indoor beach. It does not feel ridiculous from the inside, not after the first week or two. Once you notice how much steadier your afternoons feel on the days you don't skip it, and how much foggier they feel on the rare days you do. The lamps handle the morning end of things. The evening end is handled by the opposite instinct, deliberately dimming and warming the station's lighting as the scheduled evening hours approach, swapping the crisp white light of daytime work areas for something softer, warmer, dimmer, a signal every bit as deliberate as the morning brightness, telling the body, in the only language it still reliably understands, that the day is winding down even though outside the window, nothing at all has changed. Blackout curtains hang over every sleeping quarter window, not because there's any risk of the sun sneaking in. There isn't, not for months yet, but because the ambient light bleeding in from the corridors or from a colleague's late shift needs to be firmly, completely excluded if sleep is going to hold together at all. Your own quarters have a set of these curtains, heavy, lined, drawn tight each night, as part of the same small, unremarkable ritual as brushing your teeth, and you've come to appreciate just how completely dark a properly shuttered room out here can get. Dark enough that opening your eyes in the middle of the night offers no information whatsoever about whether it's 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. Only the clock knows. Only the clock is allowed to know. Meals reinforce the same fiction: breakfast, lunch, and dinner served at fixed hours, regardless of appetite or how anyone happens to feel, because a shared table at a shared hour turns out to be one of the sturdiest anchors a crew has against the slow individual drift each person's circadian rhythm would otherwise fall into left alone. Exercise gets scheduled too, often deliberately timed for the hours corresponding to what would ordinarily be daytime, partly for the researcher's physical health through a long sedentary winter, and partly because physical activity at the right scheduled hour helps reinforce the artificial day. The lights are already building, another small brick in the wall the crew has constructed together against the total absence of a real one outside. None of this, you should be honest with yourself about, works perfectly. Even with the lamps, even with the fixed meals, even with the rigid discipline of it all, there are still stretches, some weeks harder than others, where your body quietly, stubbornly insists that something about this schedule is wrong, some subtle unease that no amount of bright light fully resolves. Researchers who've wintered through several seasons here will tell you, if you ask them honestly over a late dinner, that the artificial schedule doesn't so much eliminate the disorientation of polar night as manage it, keep it contained within survivable limits, hold the crew's collective rhythm roughly together, even when any individual's private sense of time keeps threatening to slip its leash. It's not a cure. It's scaffolding, and like all scaffolding, it holds the structure up without pretending to be the structure itself. Still, it works well enough, most days, that a Tuesday afternoon under a black star-heavy sky can pass, for you, almost exactly like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon anywhere else in the world. Bright light behind you in the common room. Coffee cooling on the desk. Work to finish before the lights begin their slow, deliberate dim toward evening. The sky outside has opted out of participating in any of it, and the station, quietly, methodically, has simply gone ahead and built the day without it. Which leaves the question of where, exactly, you're going to spend the hours. The lamps have just finished convincing your body belong to evening, and what kind of shelter stands between you and a cold that would end you in minutes if these walls weren't doing their job as faithfully as the lamps do theirs? The station was not, whatever its blocky, unglamorous exterior might suggest to a first-time visitor, thrown together carelessly. Every wall, every seam, every layer between you and the air outside was chosen deliberately by people who understood exactly what kind of cold this place produces in the deep months of the season. Temperatures that can fall to -30, -40, and colder still when the wind joins in, cold severe enough that exposed skin can suffer frostbite within minutes, and a structural failure in the heating system would stop being an inconvenience and start being an emergency within a single night. You've come to think of the building less as a structure and more as a kind of second skin, a deliberately engineered barrier holding a narrow, precious bubble of survivable warmth inside an environment that would otherwise kill you with total indifference. The walls themselves are thick, layered with insulation far beyond what any ordinary building would need, sometimes raised up on stilts or pilings above the frozen ground, specifically to prevent the structure's own heat from melting the permafrost beneath it and destabilizing the foundation, a problem unique to building anything at all in ground that's supposed to stay frozen. Windows are few, small, and heavily double or triple paned, as much to hold heat in as to keep the crushing weight of accumulated snow and the battering of wind from becoming a structural liability. Every doorway to the outside runs through some version of an airlock, a small buffer chamber where you shed or don outer layers, specifically designed to keep the building's precious warm air from simply pouring out every time someone needs to step outside to check an instrument. Heating runs continuously, powered by generators that are, in their own quiet way, as important to keeping this crew alive as any piece of scientific equipment in the building, monitored, backed up, and treated with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for something people's lives quite literally depend on, because they do. Inside that shell, the station divides itself into the spaces that make a genuinely isolated, genuinely dark winter survivable in more than the purely physical sense. There are private sleeping quarters, small, simple rooms, usually just enough space for a bed, storage, a desk, modest by any ordinary standard, but treated by everyone who lives here as something close to sacred. The one space in the whole building that belongs entirely to you, where you control the light, the quiet, the temperature, the small handful of personal items that made the long trip out here with you. There are shared common spaces, too, a kitchen, a dining area, a lounge, spaces deliberately designed to be warm not just in temperature, but in feeling, comfortable furniture, decent lighting, sometimes deliberately decorated with warmer colors and softer textures, specifically chosen to counteract the visual monotony of an all-white, all-dark world outside. Laboratories and workspaces sit elsewhere in the layout, kept separate enough from the living quarters that work and rest don't blur together more than they already threaten to when the sky offers no help distinguishing one from the other. You've noticed, in your weeks here, how carefully the whole layout seems designed around a simple, unglamorous truth. Warmth alone isn't enough to keep a small, isolated crew functioning through months of darkness. The building has to manage the mind as carefully as it manages the temperature, offering enough privacy that people don't grate on each other after months in close quarters, enough shared space that isolation doesn't calcify into loneliness, enough deliberate comfort that the whole experience doesn't collapse into pure, grim endurance. The heating keeps you alive. The layout, the light, the small, deliberate warmth of the common room. That's what keeps you something closer to well and out here, through a winter this long and this dark. The difference between those two things turns out to matter enormously. Tonight, your shift finished, the lamps in the corridor already beginning their slow, scheduled dim toward evening. You make your way back toward your own small quarters, and the walk itself, short as it is, tells its own quiet story about the layers separating you from the world outside. Insulated corridor. Airlock buffer near the exterior wall, though you're not passing through it tonight. The low, steady hum of the heating system, so constant you've mostly stopped consciously hearing it, though you notice, always, on the rare occasions it briefly falters. And finally, your own door, your own small room, waiting at the end of it, where the next part of tonight's story is about to begin, in the quiet, private ritual of actually settling down to sleep in a place where the sky outside your window has nothing, tonight or for weeks still to come, to say about what time it is. Your room, when you close the door behind you, is small in the way that everything on a research station is small, every square foot accounted for. Nothing wasted, but it is entirely, completely yours. And after a day spent in shared corridors and common rooms and lab spaces full of colleagues, that particular quality of aloneness feels almost luxurious. A bed, not much larger than it needs to be, pushed against the insulated exterior wall. A narrow desk. A shelf holding the small handful of personal items you decided, months ago during packing, were worth the weight limit. A couple of books. A photograph in a simple frame. something soft-looking that doesn't belong to the station's standard-issue inventory of gray and utilitarian. The walls are thin by ordinary housing standards, station space being what it is, but thick enough, layered enough, that the building's relentless insulation reaches even in here, holding a steady, unwavering warmth against a cold that would otherwise own every inch of this room within the hour. The single most important object in the space, more important tonight than the bed itself, hangs over the window. Heavy blackout curtains, lined, weighted at the bottom hem, drawn now with the same unthinking habitual motion you use to close a book. It's a small gesture, curtains closing over a window, ordinary anywhere else in the world. Out here, it's closer to a load-bearing act, the single piece of engineering standing between your sleep tonight and a sky that would otherwise offer your eyes nothing but a confusing, unhelpful smear of stars and blackness, regardless of what hour the clock claims it to be. With the curtains drawn, the room goes properly, completely dark the moment you switch off the lamp. Dark in a way that tells your eyes absolutely nothing about time, which, after the day you've had, is precisely the point. You've learned, these past weeks, just how much this room has to work for its living. In an ordinary house, in an ordinary climate, a bedroom is mostly just a bedroom, a place to sleep and not much else, borrowing its sense of time effortlessly from the world outside its window. Out here, your room has no such luxury. It has to manufacture, entirely on its own, every single cue your body would ordinarily receive for free. Darkness has to be built rather than simply arriving with sunset. Quiet has to be actively maintained against the low, constant hum of a heating system working around the clock somewhere in the walls. Even temperature plays its part, the room kept a degree or two cooler for sleeping hours than the daytime common spaces, mimicking the natural dip in core body temperature that would ordinarily accompany a real nightfall. One more small, deliberate trick in a whole arsenal of them. Station engineers and crew alike having learned, season after season, that comfort out here isn't a given. It's constructed, piece by careful piece, the same way the walls themselves were constructed against a cold that offers no such consideration for free. There's a particular kind of privacy that matters more here than it would almost anywhere else, too. A fact you didn't fully appreciate until you'd lived a few weeks inside it. A polar research station is, by its very nature, a small world. A handful of people, sometimes as few as a dozen, sometimes several dozen depending on the site, living in genuinely close quarters for months at a stretch, working together, eating together, weathering the same endless dark together. Community, out here, isn't a nicety. It's essential, a bulwark against the particular loneliness this environment can otherwise produce. But community, sustained without pause for months on end, needs its counterweight, and that counterweight is this room, this door that closes, this small square of space where nobody else's schedule, nobody else's mood, nobody else's need for conversation reaches you. Researchers who've wintered through several seasons will tell you, if you ask, that guarding this privacy fiercely, protecting a little real solitude inside all that forced togetherness, turns out to be one of the quiet, underappreciated keys to getting through a whole season without the isolation curdling into something harder to manage. Your room isn't just where you sleep, it's where you get to simply be a single, private person again, if only for a handful of hours, before the shared rhythm of the station calls you back out into it. Tonight, though, before any of that solitude settles in properly, there's the small, unglamorous business of actually getting ready for sleep, a ritual that, out here, carries a weight it never quite had anywhere else you've lived. The bedtime routine on a station like this isn't complicated in any technical sense. No elaborate machinery, no special equipment beyond what you'd find in any ordinary home. What makes it matter is the discipline of it, the fact that every single piece is performed at roughly the same hour, in roughly the same order, night after night, for the entire length of a season that offers your body no other reliable landmarks to hold on to. You've come to think of it less as a routine and more as a kind of private ceremony, the last deliberate act of manufactured daytime before you hand the next several hours over to rest. It starts, most nights, with the lighting itself, the same slow dimming logic that governs the station's common areas extended down here into your own small space. Warmer, lower light, replacing the crisper daytime brightness as the scheduled evening hours arrive, a signal aimed squarely at that same stubborn cluster of cells behind your eyes that spent the morning being convinced sunrise had happened. You brush your teeth under this dimmer light rather than the harsher daytime bulb, another small deliberate choice, because even something this mundane, this automatic, contributes in its tiny way to the larger fiction the whole crew is collectively maintaining. You change out of your daytime layers into something looser, warmer, more clearly marked in your own mind as sleep clothing rather than work clothing, another small psychological marker in an environment that has had most of its natural markers stripped away. Reading, for many researchers, becomes an important part of this hour, and you understand exactly why once you've lived it yourself. A book, held under a warm reading lamp for 20 or 30 minutes before the lights go fully out, offers the mind a soft, gentle off-ramp from the day's work, something to focus on besides the plain, strange fact that it is by any measure the sky could offer, essentially still the middle of the night outside no matter what hour you've decided to call bedtime. Some colleagues favor music instead, low and unobtrusive, played through a small speaker while they finish the last small tasks of the evening. Others simply sit for a while, journal in hand, writing down whatever the day contained, a habit more than a few researchers pick up out here, specifically because the days can otherwise start to blur together without sunrise or sunset to mark where one ends and the next begins. Whatever the particular shape of it, the underlying purpose is the same. Building, deliberately and by hand, the winding down sensation that an ordinary evening would ordinarily hand you for free as daylight faded outside a window that, out here, offers nothing of the kind. The curtains, already drawn from earlier, get one more habitual check. The heating, already steady, gets no further attention. Trusted the way you trust the walls themselves. And finally, at the same scheduled hour you've followed for weeks now, the same hour your colleagues down the corridor are almost certainly following too, you switch off the lamp, and the room goes completely, thoroughly dark, indistinguishable in every practical sense from the black sky pressing against the far side of that curtained window. It's in this darkness, lying still, waiting for sleep to actually arrive, that the station's quiet stops being merely quiet and starts, some nights, to feel almost audible, and that particular sound, or rather the particular texture of its absence, is where tonight's story turns next. Silence, out here, isn't the same silence you'd find anywhere else, and it took you longer than you expected to understand why. In most places, even a quiet bedroom carries some faint trace of a living world beyond its walls. Distant traffic, wind through trees, the occasional call of some nocturnal animal, small ambient proof that a whole busy planet continues on somewhere just out of sight. Lying in your bunk tonight, that proof simply isn't available. Beyond the insulated walls of the station lies nothing but frozen, empty landscape stretching in every direction for a very long way. And the silence that presses in against those walls carries a particular weight to it, less an absence of sound than a presence of something, a vastness with no distractions competing against it. What you do here, in that stillness, becomes correspondingly more vivid for having so little competition. The low, steady hum of the heating system, a sound you stopped consciously registering weeks ago during the day, becomes almost a companion at night, proof, reassuring in its dull mechanical way, that the machinery keeping you alive is still faithfully doing its job. Occasionally, further off, the building itself makes small sounds as materials contract in extreme cold, a soft creak or tick somewhere in the structure, unsettling the first handful of times you heard it and almost comforting by now. Simply the sound of a building doing exactly what buildings in this kind of cold are expected to do. Wind, when it comes, announces itself clearly. A low, steady pressure against the exterior walls that can rise on the roughest nights into something with real voice to it. A howl that reminds you, whenever you hear it, with total clarity, of precisely what kind of world waits directly on the other side of these walls. And beneath all of it, or perhaps around all of it, is the darkness itself, which out here carries its own strange psychological weight distinct from the sound. You know, lying in your bunk, that outside that curtain, whatever hour the clock says, the sky is the same deep, unbroken black it's been for weeks, that if you were to somehow step outside right now, this instant, the world would look exactly, precisely the same as it did the last time you checked, and the time before that, and every time for weeks stretching backward and weeks stretching forward still to come. There's something almost meditative in that constancy. Once you stop fighting it, a stillness to the whole world outside that no ordinary place, with its churn of days and nights and changing light, ever quite offers. Some researchers describe finding a genuine, unexpected peace in this eventually, an adjustment period, usually a matter of some weeks, after which the total absence of day and night stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling, oddly, like a kind of calm. That adjustment doesn't arrive for everyone the same way or on the same timeline, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than pretending the whole experience settles neatly into peacefulness for every single person who lives through it. Isolation, sustained darkness, and the particular claustrophobia of a small crew confined together for months, these things ask something real of the people who take them on, and stations like this one don't leave that fact unaddressed. There are deliberate structures built into the season specifically to guard against the toll it can take, structures that matter every bit as much to a researcher's survival out here as the insulation in the walls or the calories in the kitchen. Exercise sits near the top of that list, not as an afterthought, but as scheduled protected time, because physical activity, researchers, and psychologists alike have found again and again, does real work against both the physical sluggishness and the low mood that extended darkness and confinement can otherwise produce. Social time gets protected too, deliberately. Meals eaten together rather than alone whenever possible. Evening hours where the common room fills with conversation, cards, some shared low-stakes entertainment, small, unremarkable gatherings that matter enormously more here than they would almost anywhere else, because out here, they're one of the primary things standing between ordinary solitude and something heavier. Hobbies, projects, small personal creative pursuits carried along specifically for these months become their own quiet anchor too. Something to look forward to at the end of a shift. Some private accomplishment measured out slowly across weeks that have otherwise stopped offering the usual daily landmarks. There's a name researchers sometimes use, informally, for the particular low mood and irritability that can creep in during the deepest, darkest stretch of a long polar season, something crews have observed and named for themselves across generations of wintering over long before any formal psychological study caught up to describe it properly, recognizing it early, naming it honestly among colleagues rather than pretending it isn't happening, turns out to matter enormously. Station veterans will tell you, because the crews that struggle most aren't usually the ones who feel the weight of the darkness. Every single person who winters here feels some version of that weight eventually. The crews that struggle most are the ones who try to carry it alone, silently, rather than leaning on the structures, the routines, and each other, that the whole station has been quietly built, brick by insulated brick, to provide. You think about this, some nights, lying in the dark listening to the low hum of the heater and the distant press of wind against the walls, turning over the strange, particular life you've chosen for this season. And then, as it always eventually does, sleep arrives anyway, not always easily, not always in one unbroken stretch, but arrives, and the long, patient dark outside continues on exactly as it has for weeks, indifferent, constant, waiting for whatever the clock decides to call morning. Morning, when it comes, announces itself the same deliberate way it always does out here, not with any change in the sky, which offers nothing at all, but with the soft, gradually intensifying glow of your room's own light fixture, engineered specifically to rouse you the way an actual sunrise would if one were available. You surface slowly, the way anyone does waking from real sleep, rather than being startled out of it, aware for a moment of the total darkness still pressing against the curtained window, aware, a beat later, that the clock beside your bed insists it is morning regardless, and aware, finally, of the small, quiet decision every researcher out here makes fresh each day, to trust the clock over the sky, because the sky, for the length of this whole long season, has simply stopped being a source anyone can rely on for that particular kind of information. There's a strangeness to this moment that never entirely disappears, no matter how many weeks you've been living inside it. Waking, by every honest sensory measure available to you, into what looks and feels for all the world like the deep, settled middle of the night, and being expected, cheerfully, routinely, to rise anyway, dress, make your way to a breakfast being served at a fixed hour precisely because enough people learned, seasons before you arrived, that without that fixed hour, the whole crew's rhythm would eventually scatter into a dozen different private, drifting versions of morning. You open the curtains anyway, some mornings, purely out of habit carried over from a lifetime spent somewhere with actual daylight, and are met, every single time, by the same unbroken black sky, stars visible if the weather's clear, nothing at all visible if it isn't, no hint anywhere along the horizon of the sun that governed every morning of your life before this posting. The light fixture in your room and the brighter dedicated lamps waiting in the common area for your scheduled morning session do real, measurable work against this strangeness. Enough that most mornings, by the time you've had your coffee and sat through your allotted minutes in front of the lamps, your body has largely accepted the fiction and settled into something that feels, close enough, like genuine alertness. But there's always a residue, some quiet part of you that notices, every single morning without fail, the gap between what the clock insists and what your eyes plainly report. A small, persistent reminder of exactly how far from an ordinary life this season has taken you. You dress in layers, the same practiced routine every morning now. Base layers first, warmer mid layers over them. Because even inside the well-heated station, a chill finds its way into the corridors nearest the exterior walls. And because dressing properly here isn't vanity or habit so much as simple continued survival, every single layer serving a specific purpose against a cold that offers no forgiveness for carelessness. You make your way toward the common room, past the same handful of colleagues emerging from their own quarters at the same scheduled hour. Everyone moving with the particular unhurried rhythm of people who've long since stopped needing to rush. Because out here, the whole day is a carefully managed, evenly paced thing, deliberately built that way specifically to avoid the kind of exhausting unpredictability that would otherwise wear a small, isolated crew down far faster than the darkness alone ever could. Breakfast waits at the same table. It waits at every morning, and the conversation around it carries the same easy, familiar rhythm of people who've spent enough consecutive weeks together to have long since exhausted the surface-level small talk and settled into something more genuine, more comfortable, more sustaining. Someone mentions the wind overnight. Someone else mentions an instrument reading that needs checking before the day's real work begins. It is, in every meaningful respect that matters to the people actually living it, an entirely ordinary breakfast, ordinary conversation, an ordinary start to an ordinary working day, and the extraordinary fact that outside every window in the building, the sky remains as dark as it was 12 hours ago, and will remain as dark 12 hours from now, has, through nothing more than sheer collective discipline and careful design, been reduced to something almost beside the point. That's the quiet, considerable achievement sitting underneath this whole morning, underneath every morning this season. One easy to miss precisely because it's been built so carefully and maintained so consistently. An entire small community of people living through conditions the human body was never naturally built to handle gracefully, managing nonetheless to construct, out of nothing but light, discipline, and each other, something that feels, hour to hour, remarkably, reassuringly close to normal. The sky opted out of helping months ago. The station simply built the day without it, and this morning, coffee in hand, breakfast conversation drifting easily around you, you are living proof that the thing worked. Fieldwork today means stepping outside, and stepping outside today means beginning preparations nearly an hour before you actually reach the door, because out here getting dressed isn't the quick, thoughtless act it is almost everywhere else in the world. It's a careful, sequenced process, and skipping a step or rushing through it carries consequences that have nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with basic survival. You start with the base layer, a close-fitting garment designed to wick moisture away from your skin, because moisture, out here, is the enemy in a way it simply isn't in milder climates, dampness against skin in temperatures, this extreme accelerating heat loss dangerously fast. Over that comes an insulating mid-layer, fleece or a synthetic fill, trapping warm air close to your body in the same way the station's own walls trap heat against the cold pressing in from outside. Over that, finally, the heavy outer shell, windproof, largely waterproof, built to withstand wind chill that can turn an already brutal air temperature into something considerably more dangerous. Hands get their own careful attention. A thin liner glove first, a heavier insulated mitten over it, because exposed skin in this cold can suffer frostbite within minutes, sometimes less if the wind is up, and a researcher who's grown careless about hand protection even once tends not to grow careless about it twice. A balaclava or face covering goes on next, leaving only a narrow band around your eyes exposed, and finally the outer hood, cinched tight and heavy insulated boots rated for temperatures considerably colder than anything you're actually likely to encounter today, because out here, the margin for error is something you build in deliberately rather than something you discover you needed after the fact. By the time you're fully dressed, you've roughly doubled your ordinary bulk, moving with the particular careful, slightly waddling gait everyone on station adopts once bundled for real outdoor work, an image that would look faintly comic anywhere else. And here is simply, unremarkably, how the job gets done. You check your gear one more time at the airlock, because the airlock itself is where the last, most important safety habit of the whole routine happens. You never go out alone. Station protocol here is absolute, non-negotiable, built from decades of hard-earned experience rather than excessive caution, because a fall, an equipment failure, a moment of disorientation in a landscape offering no natural light to navigate by, can turn from minor inconvenience to genuine emergency, far faster out here than it would almost anywhere else on Earth. Your field partner is already suited up beside you, radio checked, route discussed, a headlamp on each of you, and a spare battery in every pocket, because even the equipment you're relying on to see by has a way of struggling in cold this extreme, batteries draining faster than they would in gentler conditions, and losing your only light source out here is not a small problem. The airlock door seals behind you with the low mechanical thud that always, every single time, marks the last moment of the station's manufactured warmth before the real world outside takes over completely. And then you step out into it, the cold arriving instantly, total, pressing against every seam and gap in your layers within the first few seconds, and above you, around you, in every direction the beam of your headlamp doesn't reach, the sky in its full, uninterrupted black. Your headlamp carves out a narrow, moving circle of visible world, snow crunching underfoot with a particular high, sharp sound that only happens at temperatures this extreme, your own breath fogging instantly and audibly in the still air. And beyond that narrow circle, nothing. An absence so complete it takes real conscious effort, even weeks into the season, not to feel a small primal unease at how thoroughly the dark surrounds you. This is where you'll spend the next several hours, checking instruments, recording readings, doing the actual patient work of science in conditions that make even the simplest task considerably harder than it would be anywhere else. Fingers clumsy inside thick gloves, breath fogging over the small handheld screens you're trying to read, cold seeping in at the edges no matter how carefully you dressed. You've learned, these past weeks, a particular rhythm to this work, moving with deliberate, unhurried care, because rushing in this cold and this dark is how mistakes happen. Checking in by radio with your partner at set intervals whether or not there's anything to report, because the check-in itself matters more than its content. Proof exchanged regularly that everyone out here is still upright, still alert, still accounted for. It is, by any ordinary measure, difficult work, uncomfortable work, work that would be entirely reasonable to dread. And yet, more often than you expected before you arrived, there is something in it too, standing out here under that enormous black sky doing careful, patient, useful work that carries its own quiet satisfaction, a sense of having earned something simply by having shown up and done the job properly in conditions this unforgiving. You'll understand that satisfaction even more completely once you glance up, partway through tonight's readings, and catch your first real look at what that black sky sometimes has waiting in it. You notice it first as a faint shift at the edge of your vision, something your eyes register before your conscious mind quite catches up to what it's seeing. And when you look up properly, headlamp angled down and away so it doesn't wash out the sight, you find the sky doing something that no amount of description, before you actually witnessed it yourself, quite prepared you for. A pale green light moves slowly across the black, not fixed the way stars are fixed, but genuinely moving, folding, and unfolding like something breathing, sometimes brightening into a ribbon, sometimes fading nearly to nothing, before gathering itself again somewhere else across the sky. This is the aurora, the same phenomenon that's drawn travelers to this part of the world for centuries, and standing directly beneath it, in temperatures cold enough to bite through every layer you're wearing. It is somehow both a scientific process you understand quite well, and something that still, every single time, manages to feel entirely beyond ordinary explanation. You know the mechanism, of course, learned it long before this posting. Charged particles streaming out from the sun, carried on solar wind, colliding with gases high in the Earth's atmosphere and releasing that collision as light. The particular pale green, most commonly the signature of oxygen, rarer reds and purples appearing higher up or when solar activity runs stronger than usual. Knowing the mechanism changes nothing about the effect of actually standing under it. The sky moves. The color shifts, brightens, folds back on itself, and for however many minutes it chooses to perform, the enormous, oppressive blackness that surrounded you for weeks becomes something else entirely, something closer to wonder than to endurance. Colleagues who've wintered through several seasons here will tell you, almost without exception, that the aurora is one of the genuine, unexpected gifts of a posting that otherwise asks a great deal of the people who take it on. It doesn't appear every night, and it isn't guaranteed on any given night you happen to look up, dependent as it is on solar activity and clear skies both cooperating at once. But on the nights it does appear, standing out here in the cold, work briefly forgotten, neck craned upward, there's a general, unspoken agreement among the crew that this, specifically, is one of the things that makes the whole strange bargain of this season worth it, a private, spectacular reward that the total darkness, for all its difficulty, also makes possible in the first place. You wouldn't see this nearly so clearly, so vividly, anywhere with real ambient light competing against it. The very thing making this season so hard is the same thing making this moment so extraordinary, and standing beneath it, breath fogging, cold biting at every exposed inch of skin. You understand, for a few unhurried minutes, exactly why people keep choosing to come back. Eventually the readings need finishing, the radio check needs making, and the two of you turn back toward the station, its windows the only warm light for a very long distance in every direction, a small deliberate beacon in all that black. But the sight stays with you the rest of the shift, the rest of the evening really, the particular privilege of having witnessed something that most of the world will never get the chance to see, precisely because most of the world doesn't live inside a darkness total enough to reveal it. Back inside, gear shed layer by layer in the airlock, the warmth of the station wraps around you with a gratitude that never quite gets old, no matter how many times you've felt it this season. And ahead of you now waits the part of the day that more than any other is what actually makes a season like this survivable in the fuller sense. The return to the common room and to each other. If the darkness outside is the thing that makes this posting hard, the common room in the evening is the thing that makes it work anyway. And you've come to understand, watching how deliberately the crew treats this space and this hour, that nobody out here considers that a small or incidental fact. The room itself is unremarkable by any ordinary standard. Comfortable chairs arranged around a low table, a kitchen adjoining it, warmer lighting than the working spaces elsewhere in the station, a shelf of well-worn board games, and a small library of books that have clearly passed through many hands across many seasons. What makes it matter isn't the furniture. It's what happens inside it, night after night, deliberately, by design. Meals anchor the whole rhythm, eaten together at a shared table rather than separately, because a shared table at a fixed hour turns out to be one of the sturdiest tools available against both the circadian drift that would otherwise scatter everyone's private sense of time and the creeping isolation that months of darkness can otherwise produce. Conversation around that table has long since moved past the surface pleasantries strangers exchange, worn down by enough shared weeks into something more genuine. Colleagues who know each other's habits, moods, and small quirks with the particular intimacy that only comes from sustained close quarters. Someone is always cooking something slightly beyond what the ordinary rotation requires. A small extra effort that matters more out here than it would almost anywhere else. Because a good meal, shared, warm, unhurried, is one of the few genuinely reliable pleasures available to a crew living through a season. This stripped of the ordinary comforts a person usually takes for granted. After dinner, the room tends to divide into its familiar small rituals. A card game at one table, played with the easy, low-stakes competitiveness of people who've played each other often enough to have long since stopped taking the outcome too seriously. Someone with a guitar in the corner, not performing exactly, just playing quietly while others read or talk over it. A film some evenings, projected against a blank wall, the whole crew gathered loosely around it the way people anywhere might gather for something familiar and comforting. None of it is mandatory. Nobody's tracking attendance. But the room fills anyway, most nights, because out here the pull toward each other's company runs stronger than it would almost anywhere else. Isolation doing exactly what isolation reliably does, making ordinary human connection feel considerably less ordinary and considerably more essential than it usually gets credit for. Birthdays get marked properly out here, more properly perhaps than they would back home, because a milestone like that, celebrated together in the middle of an otherwise featureless stretch of dark, becomes a landmark worth having, something to look forward to, something to mark time by when the sky itself refuses to offer any. Midwinter, the very deepest, darkest point of the whole season, often gets its own small, deliberate celebration too, a tradition many polar stations have kept in one form or another for generations, a shared meal, some small festivity, a collective acknowledgement that the crew has reached the true bottom of the darkness, and that, from this point forward, however slowly, however gradually, the light is going to start coming back. You've come to think of these evenings, these small, deliberate rituals of shared meals and shared games and quiet shared company, as doing work every bit as essential as the heating system or the light therapy lamps. Work aimed not at the body's temperature or its circadian rhythm, but at something less easily measured and no less critical to survival out here. The simple, sustaining sense of belonging to a community that has each other's backs through a season that asks a great deal of everyone living inside it. The darkness outside hasn't gotten any less total. But in here, tonight, gathered loosely around a low table with people who understand exactly what this season demands, because they're living it right alongside you, it matters considerably less than it did standing alone at that frosted window, back at the very start of your posting. Something has shifted in you these past weeks, gradually, almost too slowly to notice while it was happening. And it's only now, well into the season, that you can look back and recognize the shape of it clearly. The disorientation that met you those first days, standing at windows, checking a black sky against a clock that insisted it was afternoon, has settled into something quieter, more manageable, something closer to acceptance than to the low, persistent unease it used to be. This is adaptation, the slow, genuine process by which a body and a mind, given enough consistent structure and enough repeated days inside it, eventually stop fighting a rhythm that has no natural cues to draw on and start simply trusting the artificial one instead. It isn't instant, and it isn't uniform across every person who winters here, some adjusting within a couple of weeks, others taking considerably longer. A difference researchers who study this kind of extended isolation attribute to real variation in individual circadian sensitivity, not to any failure of discipline or character. But given time, and given the steady, unwavering consistency of the station's manufactured schedule, most people do eventually arrive somewhere close to what you're feeling now. A body that expects breakfast at the hour. Breakfast happens. That feels genuinely sleepy as the lights begin their scheduled evening dim regardless of what the sky is or isn't doing. That has, in some deep and slightly remarkable way, learned to treat the artificial day as trustworthy as the real one it's replacing. Sleep itself has changed too over these weeks, settling into something closer to the solid, unbroken rest you remember from before this posting, rather than the fragmented, uncertain sleep of those first difficult nights. You still notice, some evenings, a faint echo of that original unease, some quiet animal part of you still registering, on some level, that the sky outside remains as wrong as it's been for weeks. But it no longer derails you the way it once did. It's become, instead, simply a fact of the season, acknowledged and then set aside, the way any sustained hardship eventually becomes something closer to background rather than crisis once a person has been living inside it long enough. There's a particular satisfaction in this adaptation that's hard to fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived through something like it. You've watched your own body and mind do something genuinely remarkable these past weeks. Take an environment that offers none of the cues human physiology evolved expecting and build, through nothing but discipline, consistency, and each other's support. Something that functions anyway, that holds together anyway, that lets an entire crew of researchers work, rest, and live something recognizably close to an ordinary life in conditions that would have seemed, from the outside, entirely unlivable. That's not a small achievement. It's the whole quiet, unglamorous accomplishment sitting underneath every single day of this posting. Easy to overlook precisely because it's been built so gradually and maintained so consistently that by now it simply feels, most days, like life. And there is, waiting somewhere ahead on the calendar though still weeks distant, the promise of an ending to all of it. A day, marked and anticipated and genuinely celebrated by everyone on station, when the sun will finally, for the first time in months, break the horizon again, if only briefly, if only for a few precious minutes before dipping back below it. You think about that day sometimes, in the quiet hours, not with impatience exactly, because the season you're living through now has its own particular value, its own hard-won rhythm you've come to genuinely respect, but with a kind of settled anticipation, the way anyone looks forward to something they know is coming, and trust will arrive exactly when it's supposed to. For now, though, there's tonight and the dark outside the window, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built carefully enough to hold its shape against a world that offers it no natural help at all. There's a particular day on the calendar that every crew member out here marks well in advance, circled, anticipated, discussed in the kind of low, excited tones people usually reserve for holidays. And today is that day. For weeks now, the deepest part of the darkness has been gradually, almost imperceptibly loosening its grip, the brief stretch of pale twilight each day growing by a few more minutes at a time, so slowly that you'd have missed it entirely if you hadn't been tracking it deliberately. A small note added to the station log each week, measuring the faint brightening at the horizon. Today, though, the change stops being gradual and becomes, for the first time in months, unmistakable. The whole crew gathers outside for it, bundled in full cold weather gear, gloved hands holding mugs of something hot, faces turned toward a particular point on the southern horizon that everyone on station could probably locate blindfolded by now, having watched it so carefully these past weeks. Nobody needs to be told when to be there. Word passes through the station on its own, quiet and certain, the way word does about things that matter to everyone equally. You stand together in the cold, breath fogging, waiting, and for a long stretch, nothing happens at all, the horizon holding at that same pale, promising gray gold it's held for the last several mornings. And then, slowly, unmistakably, a sliver of true gold breaks the line where sky meets ice, and for the first time in longer than you can now easily calculate, direct sunlight touches this place. It doesn't last. A few minutes at most, the sun barely, clearing the horizon before sinking back below it, the barest possible taste of a day that will, over the coming weeks, gradually lengthen back into something ordinary. But those few minutes carry a weight entirely disproportionate to their length. Someone near you actually laughs out loud, a sound of pure, uncomplicated relief. Someone else simply stands very still, face tilted up, eyes closed, letting whatever thin actual warmth the light carries land on exposed skin for the first time in what has felt, by now, like a very long while indeed. You find your own eyes stinging slightly, not from the cold exactly, and you're not alone in that either, glancing sideways at colleagues blinking rapidly against a brightness none of you have properly seen in months. It is, without exaggeration, one of the more genuinely moving things you've witnessed in your life. This brief, modest return of an ordinary star that the rest of the world takes entirely for granted every single day. You understand standing here? Something you couldn't have fully understood before living through the months that preceded it. That sunlight is not, in fact, a given. It's a gift, quietly, constantly delivered to nearly everywhere else on the planet, without anyone there ever pausing to notice, and only truly visible as a gift once you've gone long enough without it. The sun dips back below the horizon within minutes, and the sky returns to its familiar deep twilight. Not yet true day, not for weeks still. But something fundamental has shifted regardless, a corner turned that the whole crew feels collectively. A long, difficult season that has, as of this morning, officially, undeniably, begun its slow retreat. Standing there in the cold with your colleagues, watching the horizon settle back into its long gray glow, you find yourself thinking back over everything the past months have actually required of you, and what, exactly, has made it possible to reach this particular morning intact. It wasn't willpower alone, you've come to understand, watching the season unfold and watching your own adjustment to it happen gradually rather than through sheer stubborn force of character. It was structure, deliberate and unwavering, the fixed hours for meals and light and sleep that gave your drifting body something reliable to hold on to when the sky offered nothing at all. It was the architecture around you, walls and insulation and careful engineering, standing between a killing cold and a survivable warmth, doing quiet, essential work every single hour of every single day without ever asking for credit. It was the lamps, faithfully mimicking a sunrise your own eyes desperately needed even when the real one wasn't available, convincing a stubborn cluster of cells behind your eyes that morning had arrived regardless of what the actual sky was doing. And more than any single piece of engineering or any single scheduled ritual, it was the people, the small, tightly knit community who shared this season with you, who sat across the same table at the same fixed hour night after night, who noticed when someone's mood had dipped a little lower than usual and made room for it without judgment, who stood beside you tonight and every night the aurora chose to perform, sharing in a wonder that would have meant considerably less experienced alone. There's something worth sitting with in this moment about what this whole season actually proves. Human beings, it turns out, were never built for an environment like this one. No natural instinct, no evolved capacity, prepared any of you for months without a sunrise. And yet here you all stand, having lived through exactly that, not merely surviving it in some grim, gritted teeth sense, but having built deliberately out of nothing but light and structure and each other, something that actually worked, that let each of you sleep, eat, laugh, do genuinely valuable scientific work, and reach this morning whole. That's not a small thing. It's arguably one of the more remarkable, quietly underappreciated demonstrations of what people are actually capable of when they commit to building the right structure around a problem nature never designed them to solve alone. You think, too, about everyone who came before you, at stations like this one. Decades of researchers who wintered through the same darkness, made many of the same discoveries about light and schedule and community that you've made yourself these past months, and left behind in station logs and shared traditions and simple accumulated institutional wisdom, exactly the kind of structure that made your own season considerably easier than it might otherwise have been. You'll leave something behind, too, when your own posting eventually ends, some small addition to that same accumulated knowledge, available to whoever comes after you to make their own season, in some small way, a little more manageable than it would have been without it. For now, though, the morning's brief sunrise has already passed, and the day's ordinary work is waiting. Instruments to check, readings to record, all the patient, unglamorous labor that brought you out here in the first place. You turn back toward the station with your colleagues, the horizon behind you still holding its long gray glow, and the walk back feels, somehow, lighter than it did on the way out, though nothing about the cold or the distance has actually changed. Only your own understanding of what waits at the end of this particular season, growing closer now, one returning sunrise at a time. It's late, well past the hour the schedule has trained your body to expect sleep, and instead of your own quarters, you find yourself back at that same frosted window where this whole season, for you, effectively began, watching a sky that, tonight, offers something it withheld for so many of the nights before it. Stars, familiar by now, scattered in their same patient arrangement. And low along the horizon, the faint lingering trace of the light that touched this place so briefly this morning, already fading now toward the deeper blue-black of full night, but not quite gone. Not the way it was gone entirely for all those weeks before today. You've thought, more than once these past months, about what it actually means to sleep well somewhere the ordinary architecture of day and night has been so thoroughly dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. It means you've come to understand, trusting things you can't directly verify with your own senses, trusting a clock over a sky, trusting a lamp's manufactured glow over the sun's absence, trusting that the careful structure a whole crew has built together, meal by meal, scheduled hour by scheduled hour, will continue holding steady even when your own body's ancient instincts insist, quietly and persistently, that something about all of it remains wrong. It means, too, learning to find real comfort inside that structure, rather than merely enduring it, discovering somewhere in the accumulated weeks that a darkness total enough to have once felt oppressive can become, eventually, something closer to peaceful, a stillness. The ordinary churn of day and night rarely offers anywhere else. You think about your own bed waiting down the corridor, curtains already drawn against a sky that, tonight for the first time in a long while, actually has something faint and gold to hide, rather than nothing at all. You think about the lamps that will wake you gently in what the clock calls morning, about the shared table where breakfast will be waiting at its same fixed hour, about the colleagues who've become, across these difficult, beautiful months, something closer to family than the word colleague quite captures. You think about the aurora folding slowly across a black sky, about the particular satisfaction of instruments checked properly in brutal cold, about a season that asked a great deal of you, and in exchange taught you something about resilience, about structure, about the quiet, considerable strength of a small community that chooses, deliberately, to look after each other through conditions that would be genuinely unlivable faced alone. The walk back to your quarters is short, familiar by now down to every step, and your room, when you reach it, is exactly as you left it, small, warm, entirely your own. You draw the curtains one final time tonight, though there's less behind them to hide now than there was for so many weeks before, and you settle into a bed that has, across this long, strange season, become genuinely deeply comfortable despite a sky outside that spent months offering no cooperation at all. The lamp switches off. The room goes dark. The same total, complete darkness it's held every night since you arrived, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the insulation and the airlock and the careful engineered warmth holding this whole small world together, the vast, quiet Arctic continues exactly as it has for months, indifferent, patient, magnificent, asking nothing further of you tonight beyond the simple, well-earned rest that's waiting for you now, right where you left it. So here we are, at the quiet close of a very long season. You've watched a sky offer nothing at all for months on end, and learned to build morning anyway, out of lamps and discipline, and a clock trusted more than your own eyes. You've slept through darkness total enough to erase every ordinary boundary between one day and the next, and found, somewhere in the accumulated weeks, a genuine, hard-won peace inside it. You've stood beneath an aurora painting slow green light across a black sky, felt a cold that would kill in minutes pressing patiently against walls built to hold it out, and sat, night after night, at a shared table with people who became, across it all, something considerably more than colleagues. Spare a thought tonight for everyone still out there right now, in stations scattered across the far north and the far south both, living through exactly this, manufacturing their own morning from nothing but light and habit and each other, months from the next sunrise, doing quiet, patient, valuable work in conditions most of us will never have to face ourselves. Their resilience isn't loud, it isn't dramatic. It's built, mostly, from unglamorous routine repeated faithfully, day after dark day, until the routine itself becomes a kind of quiet strength. As you settle in tonight, wherever you happen to be, under whatever ordinary sky is waiting outside your own window, take a moment to notice something the researchers in tonight's story would never take for granted again. The light, whenever it comes, and the dark, when it's finally time to rest. Let your own room go dim and quiet around you the way theirs does at the end of every long shift. Sleep well tonight. You have a whole sky's worth of ordinary sunrise waiting for you tomorrow. And that, however easy it is to forget, is no small thing at all.